So now we're going to jump into talking about fats. Fats are another place where conventional medicine and functional medicine are just like not seeing eye to eye. And unfortunately, of course, I'm coming from a functional medicine perspective, but the reality is that when we look at conventional medicine, fats are a great example of how as conventional medicine has been developing in the United States over the past 75 years or so, there have been many influences that influence what the recommendations are and how insurance companies do things and medications that are made and these kinds of things. So some of those influences are money, and money is a major influence, but the insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the food industry, these are all places where sometimes we have to be really careful about who's doing the studies and what the studies are saying. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history on this. There's a great book. It is called Eat Fat, Get Thin, and that one is by Mark Hyman. The first 100 pages or so is a great history. I'm going to give you the 5-minute rundown of the history, so maybe you don't need to read the book, but it's a very interesting read. So JFK says, for the great enemy of truth is very often not the lie, the deliberate, contrived, and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. So with that, fat got demonized around the 1950s, and this demonization has continued to this day and resulted in the Great Food Pyramid of 1992, which recommended high carbohydrate and low fat, actually 11 servings of bread per day. It just is shocking to me. And then using fats and oils sparingly. Then again, the big question, why low fat, high carb? And the supposition was, of course, that fat causes fat in the body and is a major cause of cardiovascular death. But in the journal Circulation, it attributes 184,000 deaths per year to sugary drinks. So maybe we're starting to turn around our thinking. But a history of fat. So the Joslin Diabetes Center in Harvard in the 1920s, they recommended a diet of 75% fat and 5% carbohydrate to treat diabetes. And they were having a lot of success with that. And then in the 1950s, the short story is in the 1950s and 60s, fat became demonized because there was a study that came out that said fat causes fat. And just looking at how things change again in 2010s, now Joslin Diabetes Center is now going back to recommending almost exactly what they did in 1920, but it took them 90 years to go full circle around. The American Diabetes Association is still recommending avoiding fats. And actually, I got blacklisted from my local hospital because the dietitians there who are teaching diabetes, teaching to diabetics, they're all taught by the old school, which is the low fat diet. And no matter what research comes out and what papers are written, the whole medical system is just geared on that fat causes fat and fat causes heart disease and not paying attention to carbohydrate metabolism. And then there's the French paradox, where we know our French compadres, they eat a lot of fat and they don't have a lot of heart disease. So let's talk a little more about that. The story about the early debate is that in 1953, there was a guy named Ancel Keys, and they did a study in 22 countries that looked at heart disease, death rates, and fat consumption. So it was 22 countries. But when Ancel Keys wrote the paper, he chose 6 countries that stood out with the conclusion that eating lots of fat caused more heart disease and more death. And that was in 1953. And that was a study that really took things and ran with them. And then there was another study in 1957 that said that there was no correlation between fat and heart disease, but it was too late for that. Because when this 1953 study came out, everything just went boom, low fat. It was challenged over and over again. It was challenged from the 1960s to 1980s. It was like the train had already left the station. We're in this low fat phase. And then actually in 1984, this same Ansel Keys republished showing, correcting himself, that there's actually no relationship between fat intake and heart disease. And then in 1999, that same study, the 1953 study, was reanalyzed. And the conclusion of the 1953 study was actually that sugar has much more to do with heart disease than fat. And we are still fighting this battle. We are still fighting this battle. But in conventional medicine, it is still low fat. And we are really dealing with these major corporations, and we're talking about these major associations that have, it takes just, it's like moving a humongous tanker in the water. It takes a really long time to make any kind of change. So all of these organizations are still dealing with these issues. I know that Weight Watchers has changed a little bit. We start seeing little bits of change here and there. But basically, in review of the studies on heart disease risk, that we know now that high fat, low carb diets are better than low fat, high carb in preventing heart disease. And a plant-based diet is super, super important. That's the key, is eating lots of plants for both nutrition and fiber. The reality is that animal products are not, for people who eat animal products, are not necessarily the enemy, but they need to be safe and smart. Because if we're eating animal products that are conventionally grown, the animals are completely stressed. They're eating horrible grains and lots of pesticides and herbicides and toxins. The meats are very inflammatory. The fats in the meats are very inflammatory, because that's where the fats are what are holding on to lots of the toxins, just like they do in our bodies. But if we're eating lean meats, and we're eating relatively lean meats, we're eating pasture-raised, organic, treated animals, the functional medicine conclusion, at least at this point in time, and for probably the last 20 years, has been then in moderation, animal products are fine, as long as we're continuing to be plant-based and we're getting plenty of good nutrition and good fiber. So the skinny on fats. So when we're talking about fats, there are saturated fats, and there are monounsaturated fats or polyunsaturated fats, which are omega-3s and omega-6s, and then trans fats, which we're not really seeing so much anymore. So let's talk about saturated fats real quickly. Saturated fats have never been linked to heart disease, and improvement of overall cholesterol and low carb diet. You can do that by decreasing triglycerides, raising HDL, and decreasing small and dense LDL. Saturated fats can actually improve inflammation or not affect inflammation. And again, we talked about animal products and how we need to be careful about how they're fed. So some of the most common saturated fats are laurate, myristate, palmitate, and stearate. And again, they do really good things in the body. They help to strengthen the immune system. They help the lungs. They're required to make hormones. They're critical for the nervous system. They help to suppress inflammation, and they contain essential fat soluble vitamins like A, D, and K2. And good brain function depends on us getting enough saturated fats. So saturated fats are really important. We need enough of them. And this is the big argument, and this is a lot of what Dr. Hyman talks about in his book, Eat Fat, Get Thin, is that we actually need these saturated fats in our diets. They're really good for us. They do a lot of really important things. And when we're eating a super low saturated fat diet, then we may not be getting everything that we need. I just wanted to mention very briefly trans fats, because they're almost gone, which is great, but a lot of us still have trans fats in our bodies from when they were very common and very available. But in 1994, it was estimated that there were 30,000 deaths a year from heart disease. When we look at heart disease again, and I've said this before, I'm saying it again, but heart disease, like when we're looking at what actually causes plaque and what actually causes the arteries to block up, it is a combination of cholesterol, of particularly the small dense LDL, and inflammation, because inflammation makes that plaque lay itself down. The partially hydrogenated oils were causing lots of inflammation in our bodies, and therefore were responsible for lots of heart disease, dementia, diabetes, and cancer risk, as well as obesity. It's still out there in very small amounts, in trace amounts mostly, because it is made in some of the processing of some of our foods, but mostly in processed foods, and it's not added to processed foods anymore. So I'm going to break down we're going back to the good fats now. There are monounsaturated fats and there are polyunsaturated fats. So monounsaturated fats, really good for you. These are the fats that we're finding in olives and avocados and certain fish, macadamia nuts, and other nuts. It's also found in dairy and animals. Excellent for heart health and cardiovascular health, and rich in lots of nutrients, and helps to improve insulin sensitivity, reduces breast cancer risk, all kinds of things, reduces pain in some inflammatory syndromes and autoimmune issues, helps to promote weight loss, and helps to reduce belly fat. Processing these oils, processing certain vegetable oils can make them bad. Like canola is actually not, canola is genetically modified. It's actually a hybrid type of oil. It's not a natural oil. Avocado oil, I love it because you can cook with it at very high temperature. Olive oil, I love it because it's got so many studies and it tastes really good. But using it to put over food that's already been cooked, or the food that is cooking at very low temperatures, we want to be careful with olive oil, because when it gets too hot, it can oxidize actually, and it's not a very good thing for us. But anyway, avocado oils, sunflower oil, these oils are really great. We want to be really careful about the soy oils and the canola oils and that kind of stuff, because those are not nearly as nutritious. So the omega-6s and omega-3s, of which there is a ton of talk, they're polyunsaturated oils, and they're considered essential fatty acids, meaning that our body does not make them, and they are the kind of the parents of the omega-6s and omega-3s. Linoleic acid is the parent of all the omega-6 fats, and alpha linoleic acid is the parent of all the omega-3 fats. There are processes that break down the fats and turn the fats into other fats. And as I said, linoleic acid is the kind of the master omega-6, and alpha linoleic is the master of the omega-3 and can turn into EPA, DPA, and DHA, whereas linoleic acid turns into GLA and arachidonic acid. But this is a nice little chart because it also tells you where you can get these different oils from. And the role of essential fatty acids, boy, they do all kinds of things. So they're really important in cell membrane structure and function. They have a role in the function of the retina, in the gray matter of the brain and the central nervous system. They play a role in the immune response, and they actually are pre-resolving mediators are made out of essential fatty acids to help to clean up inflammation around our bodies. And that's just a smattering of how good these essential fatty acids are. So again, processing really important. Corn oil, safflower oil, canola oil, because of the way they're processed, can be really pro-inflammatory. And best oils for heat: sesame, coconut, red palm, spectrum palm, or avocado. And in treatment, so we use omega-3s, like high dose omega-3s, for all kinds of things. It can really help with hypertriglyceridemia, type 2 diabetes, neuropsych disorders, autism. I've seen several situations in which kids had defiant disorders or ADHD, or they were just undiagnosed, out of control parents gave them high doses of omega-3s and things really improved. Sleep improves with it too. Autoimmune disorders, immune dysfunction, berry dysfunction. And it is all about ratios. Like the omega-6s are good for us, but in too much, if the ratio between omega-6s and omega-3s are too great, then omega-6s then become somewhat pro-inflammatory. If we have too high a ratio, it can depress immune function and contribute to weight gain and inflammation. So we want to be careful that we're getting enough of our omega-3s and that we're to balance our omega-6s. The high ratio can cause oxidized LDL and make the blood more sticky. So food sources of our omega-3s are mainly fish oil is the best source for omega-3s. That does make it a lot harder for our vegetarian and vegan folks. But if you look in that last table that I showed you, it does show where you can get some other forms of I think I'm going to go back really quick and just show you, boom, that right there. You can get alpha linoleic acid from flax and chia, and canola does have it, walnuts and soybeans, and then algae as well can give you EPA as well, and oily fish, and they can give you EPA and DHA as well. Okay, so that chart there was just when they talk about a serving, it's about the size of a deck of cards. But these are serving sizes and they recommend at least a couple of servings per week. And then these are some other food sources of alpha linoleic acid, which is the grandfather of the omega-3s. Other fat facts, 90% of Americans don't take in enough omega-3s. So if you have enough omega-3s, then you can eat more saturated fats. It can be actually beneficial to your cholesterol. So saturated fat, the only time it promotes inflammation is if there are also too many carbs or there's not enough fiber. So if your patient's asking you, can I eat saturated fat? Can I eat animal products? Yes, in moderation, as long as they're clean and as long as you're watching your carbs, not having too many carbs, and you're eating some fiber along with it. And just a reminder that saturated fats, and I've only said this about 11 times so far, have never been linked to heart disease. Just if there's one thing you take home, it's saturated fats have not ever been linked to heart disease. And some people ask about coconut, and so coconut has a lot of medium chain triglycerides, and it is a really good type of saturated fat. I have seen some people who do their triglyceride levels on coconut if they're just really pounding. I had some patients who just fell in love with coconut oil and just started pounding the coconut oil, and their triglycerides actually went up a little bit with even though they were keeping their carbs low. So that's just one thing to be a little bit aware of. And this is just a table that shows you where you can get omega-6 fatty acids, and these are some of the oils that aren't the best oils to be using on a regular basis and for cooking. The Linus Pauling Institute, which is where I got these charts, they recommend eating fish twice weekly and then consuming lots of foods that are rich in ALA, like walnuts, flax seeds, and flaxseed oil.